deal with another important symptom, which is very common not only in cancer but also in any other patients. Uh, and the importance of this symptom is that whenever we have breathlessness, we have uh, various feelings about that symptoms, and sometimes even we think that we are going to die. So it is not only going to be a physical problem, but also it can cause various other aspects of suffering. And usually, this is managed by bronchodilators and many other conventional agents. But in case of refractory or very severe respiratory problems, then we have to use other medications also. Uh, so we will hear regarding this from Dr. Rajamayer. So Dr. Rajamayer is a pulmonologist, and she is working in Hinduja Hospital as well as Bhatia Hospital. She is not only a pulmonologist but also a palliative care physician. So it's over to you, and welcome you.
Thank you, Sunil, and thank you, Rajalakshmi, and thank you, Pallium India, for this opportunity. It's lovely to see so many of you from varied parts of the globe. I just wanted to, get an idea of Sunil. Probably you or Rajalakshmi can tell me what is the background of our participants today. Are they all working in private sector, public sector, and what is their background in the sense? What part of healthcare are they in? Then I accordingly I can tailor my this thing talk according to their needs. And please feel free to interrupt or interject at any time, because I think an interactive session makes it most interesting. So it's nice. Thank you all for joining in today. Sunil, can you tell me a brief of the background of our
Yeah,
participants?
most of them are having MBBS or specialization in various specialties, but a few of
Okay.
them are BDS, dental doctors who are interested in palliative care.
Right.
Rajalakshmi, can you tell me more about the organizations they are working?
Ma'am, we have a mix of both private and public
Okay.
doctors coming in, and we
Okay.
have doctors from UAE and Nepal too, Nigeria, South Africa, and Bangladesh too, apart from India.
Excellent. So thank you very much for joining in. And I'm quite glad that there is so much interest to hear about palliative care. And this is how many weeks of training? Have they heard of other sessions also? Or is it the first non-cancer palliative care session?
No, they have had I think more than 8 9 sessions.
Okay,
Am I
fine.
right, Rajalakshmi?
Yes, ma'am, we have completed sessions on pain management, palliative care, and non cancerous illness, medical ethics, difficult pain, all such sessions. And we have completed gastrointestinal symptoms too.
Okay, fine. Okay, so you're all very much into the training. So without wasting any more time, I will start with my presentation today. And that is being a pulmonologist, I'm extremely passionate about palliative care, especially in respiratory medicine. And to like Sunil told you, I'm working in Mumbai, and I do look after a lot of patients with advanced respiratory illnesses. And to name a few, it is a lot of patients of COPD, interstitial lung disease, pulmonary hypertension, congestive cardiac failure. But because there are few palliative care physicians in the city, and even lesser who look after non cancer conditions, I do end up looking at other organ failures like dementia, Parkinson's, motor neuron disease, as well as patients with chronic liver, as well as chronic kidney diseases. So, just to start my topic, I think it's important for me to basically tell you what I will be talking to you today. First of all is the need for palliative care in respiratory conditions. Second thing is to introduce you to entity called as chronic breathlessness syndrome. How, like Sunil mentioned, you are all aware of other treatments for breathlessness, but how morphine fits into the treatment of chronic breathlessness syndrome, and how we can palliate, which is to cloak or support these patients and control their difficult respiratory symptoms, especially when we cannot achieve a cure. So, this is what we will cover today. And I hope to finish in 40-45 minutes so we can be comfortable with respect to time. So, to start with, this is a little outdated slide, but I think the newer percentage is out now, and which only shows that today in India, more and more people are affected by non-communicable diseases, and non-communicable diseases make a big chunk of the cause of death of India and among in India. And amongst the non-communicable diseases, if you have a look closely, it is mainly to do with respiratory conditions, lower respiratory tract infections, diabetes, cardiovascular conditions, as well as cerebrovascular conditions. So, if you see, a large chunk of Indians who are affected by non communicable diseases is high. Non communicable diseases form a large part of the cause of deaths in India, and therefore we need to focus on these conditions, because if all of you will agree with me, non communicable diseases are mostly incurable, they are mostly controllable. We cannot cure blood pressure, dyslipidemia, diabetes, cardiac conditions. What we do is offer lifestyle changes, and we offer medications to control, like how we do in respiratory conditions. So if you were to ask yourself, or let me pose a question to you, for example, of all the conditions that you treat, which are the patients you're actually managing to cure 100%? Please do put in the chat box. Sunil will keep an eye on the chat, but do think of all the organs: neurology, renal, hepatic, gastro, respiratory, cardiac. Think of which conditions in all these systems are you able to cure 100%. Avnish Khare has written that chronic conditions need holistic care and wellness approach. Absolutely. So, yes, you're very correct. Infectious diseases, yes, Geeta, very, very common conditions is infectious diseases, and therefore we are able to make these patients better, almost equal to their original quality and functionality of life. Yes, and certain surgical conditions like appendicitis, or say for example, you have an infected in part of the intestine, or some abscess, or so those kind of things. But if you think, one third of the conditions we are able to cure, one third we are able to control, and one third is incurable. So if you sit to think of it, almost two-thirds of the conditions seen by medical professionals are not completely curable. Therefore, we need to focus on holistic care, and we also need to focus on something that we can offer these patients and family in order to reduce their health related suffering. Yes, somebody Dr. Sudha has also mentioned about nutritional deficiencies. Yes, these things can be cured, but there are many illnesses which either we control or which are incurable. And therefore, it is important to realize that what that patient particularly undergoes during his journey through diabetes, through blood pressure, through COPD, through interstitial lung disease, is something which can be a roller coaster of emotions, not just physical, mental, psychological, and spiritual. And that's exactly what palliative care does. So, if you look at the statistics in India today, we have 18% of the world's population, but the 32% of the world's burden of chronic respiratory conditions. So, we have the one third of the global burden of respiratory diseases. So, it's a lot. Plus, to add to that, we now have COVID. So, COVID has just complicated the life of a pulmonary physician. So please remember that, along with the fact that there is a very scary statistic that in the next 30 years, our country is going to be a graying population. So we have going to have a tremendous increase in the 60 and 80-year-olds, which means we are going to deal with much weaker lungs. So which means with the COVID pandemic, with the aging population, And with such a large burden of respiratory conditions, it is something that we need to focus on is the importance of integrating palliative care whenever we teach doctors respiratory medicine, or for that matter, whenever we educate doctors, even during MBBS. The most common symptom amongst what the respiratory physicians see is probably breathlessness. Now, one thing we need to remember is that breathlessness is not just a condition related to the chest. It could be because of cardiac conditions, it could be because of deconditioned status, it could also be because of other general conditions like anemia. It could be because of anxiety. So there are multiple causes of breathlessness, but yes, one of the main things in respiratory symptoms is the breathlessness, which is due to respiratory condition. So roughly about 75 million people suffer from breathlessness worldwide, and of this accounts to majority is respiratory illnesses, some amount of incurable cancers, and those with cardiac disease also contribute to the number of breathlessness. And it is one of the most common symptoms that we see in our outpatient clinic. So, just like I mentioned to you before, it's not just the respiratory medicine which actually contributes to breathlessness. But in respiratory medicine, the causes of breathlessness could be airway, which is asthma, COPD, bronchiectasis, as well as bronchogenic carcinoma. It could be pleural, so pleural effusion, pneumothorax, hydropneumothorax. It could be mediastinal, where there could be lymph nodes, or there could be mediastinal pneumothorax, as well as vascular. So embolism, pulmonary hypertension, and the other big chunk contributing to breathlessness is parenchymal conditions, chronic ones like interstitial lung disease, which is a large umbrella of conditions where there are more than 1,000 to 2,000 causes which can lead to interstitial lung fibrosis. Besides this, the heart is the next contributory factor for giving us breathlessness. So, congestive cardiac failure, where the heart is unable to pump, there results in alveolar edema, and therefore patients come to you with acute breathlessness or acute and chronic breathlessness. Then, of course, all those causes which cause the pump failure. So, from the brain, when, like for example, motor neuron disease, a stroke, etc., can also give rise to lung breathlessness. And then in cancer, very often these patients are cachectic because of anorexia cachexia syndrome, and they have a lot of muscle mass, they are deconditioned, that can also result in breathlessness. Now, this is another reason why we need to focus on why it is important for non-communicable diseases like organ failure to be a part of the palliative care spectrum. Because historically, palliative care was started for advanced cancers. Very often, doctors, including and patients and the community at large, feel that palliative care is only for cancer, and that too for cancer towards the end of life. Both these statements are not true. Palliative care is for all those chronic, serious, incurable, progressive illness where there is a lot of health related suffering. So it's not diagnosis based, it is not prognosis based, it is need based, need of the patient and need of the family. So that is important. And second thing, earlier the palliative care, there is enough evidence to suggest how much a difference we can make in the life of the patient and the family. So quickly to tell you, if you divide the causes of death into four different categories as to how people die, some people can have sudden deaths, which unfortunately is only 1 in 7 people. So the rest go through a bed-bound phase, making all the more important the focus on palliative care. The today's topic focus will be on the graph C, where most of our patients are diagnosed with a chronic respiratory illness, say like COPD, interstitial lung disease, at a particular point in their life, say around 60 or 65. Every dip that they have here is an acute exacerbation, and every dip that they come with could have been resulting in death. But because of modern medicine, these patients go back home, but with a decreased quality of life. Every hospital admission, the doctor comes in touch with the patient, the family, only during the acute attacks. What happens to these patients once they go home is something that doctors are completely unaware of. Are they able to walk, talk, clean themselves? Are they sleeping? Are they frustrated? Are they depressed? None of these issues we know. We only are focused, and our training is also focused on physical symptoms, and our training is focused on cure. But what is important is to realize how these patients live such a prolonged period of life with a very high symptom burden, and each of these admissions, so their whole life is surrounded by doctors, it's surrounded by medicines, it's housebound, and most of our patients with chronic respiratory illnesses die a social death even before a physical one. So these patients are our focus for this afternoon's discussion, and most of our patients with organ failure fit into this. And there's a large amount of people in this country who are affected by this. And why is it important to talk about it? Because today in India, we do rank one of the 15 worst countries to die in. Our patients are dying with a lot of suffering, especially at the end of life. This suffering can be avoided if a lot of discussions and if a lot of uh, explanations and communication can be done to the patient and the family. So coming back to breathlessness. So first part was to highlight the need for palliative care in respiratory conditions, the fact that these patients live a very prolonged period of life with high symptom burden. Patient and the family goes through a lot of physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual distress and financial in certain big cities. And therefore, addressing all these issues is the main focus of palliative care. And therefore, it is very important to introduce palliative care at the right time in these patients. So, if everybody is clear on this, I will proceed to how we tackle with breathlessness. And if there's any question, please put it on the chat box. So when we come to talking of breathlessness, we have the different classifications of breathlessness. And what might that be? It is acute breathlessness, acute on chronic, and chronic. Acute is beyond the purview of palliative care because it is something that we don't know why it has happened and it's suddenly out of the blue. And obviously, we will take the patient to the casualty and ICU and do everything in the patient's best interest. Most of the patients we are talking about are those who have been diagnosed with a chronic respiratory illness and who are breathless every single day of their life. These patients can suddenly become worse, and that's called as acute and chronic breathlessness. To assess breathlessness, we have these various methods. The New York Heart Association is for cardiac conditions. The Modified Medical Research Council is for respiratory conditions. And then we have the BOG scale, which we use when we use to evaluate these patients of breathlessness. So this is just for your information. It's available on the web. And this presentation is also going to be shared by Pallium India. So, and with the Echo class, with the Echo platform. So New York Heart Association describes it as class 1 to class 4 to see that fourth class is the worst grade of breathlessness. And in MMRC, which is the Modified Medical Research Council for breathlessness due to respiratory conditions, these are grades and they start from grade 0 to grade 4, with grade 4 being the worst or the patient who is breathless on rest or very minimal activity. Okay, so whenever you have a patient of breathlessness, it is of course very, very important to take a detailed history and do a proper clinical examination. But there's some basic investigations need to be included, which is probably imaging, which is X-ray and HRCT, lung function test. I cannot undermine the importance of lung function test, which is probably not done as much as it should be done. It's very, very important to do the PFT with bronchodilator reversibility so that we know if it's a reversible airway condition and how much we can help the patient. Also, this lung function test must include arterial blood gas and a 6-minute walk test. A 6-minute walk test tells us how much the patient's oxygen is at baseline, which is rest, and how much does the oxygen change on walking. Normal people, you and me, the oxygen level increases on exercise. But in patients with interstitial lung disease, it falls, and therefore it's an indication to start long-term oxygen therapy. Besides this, it is important also to do cardiac evaluation like the 2D echo, which is obviously followed by an ECG. So this is a comprehensive investigation list for breathlessness. Once you think of a patient who's chronically breathless, We very often, because of our training, tend to focus on the physical symptoms. So, whenever we follow up these patients with breathlessness, we almost always focus on, is the breathlessness better? Has it improved? Has it worsened? Is your cough better? Are you eating well? Are you sleeping well? But just imagine a patient who is breathless 24/7. If a patient is breathless for 24/7, day in and day out, imagine all that his mind is, the only thing that is overactive is his mind. So, therefore, these patients who are breathless every single day of their life, they have a lot of issues. And what may that be? That is, first of all, they're dependent on others for activities of daily living. They need help to go to the bathroom, for shower, to be taken to feed themselves, to change themselves. So that leads to a loss of role. Plus, they're isolated because they're not able to go out of the house. They're oxygen bound, they're homebound, they are very, very depressed, they're frustrated, and also have a constant anxiety factor. And they're always almost worried about death at any time. Whenever they get more breathless, they are more anxious. So, this is explained very beautifully in this model, which is called as a breathing, thinking, function model. So when we train ourselves to be chest physicians, we're only talked about breathing. We know that there is an increased work of breathing. We know the accessory muscles of respiration are increased. We know that the patient's respiratory rate is increased. But what actually happens to this patient? This patient's mind is overactive. He has all thoughts of doom and gloom. He's thinking of dying. He's getting more and more anxious. There's sense of panic. And because of that, and because of the breathlessness, this patient says feels even more scared to start walking, because he says, if I do this much, I get breathless, so let me not do that much. So patient becomes more and more and more sedentary, and therefore he also gets more and more bed bound with the loss of muscle function, because if you don't use your muscles, you lose your muscles. So that sets in the deconditioning. This results in further worsening of breathlessness, because now he's not even used to walking those 5 steps. So this patient of ours is caught in this vicious cycle of, first of all, being breathless, then being anxious, then doing less. And because of that, he's more breathless, more anxious, does even less. So, we in palliative care look at these patients of chronic breathlessness and help them by a multidisciplinary approach. So, it's very important when you're talking to a patient of chronic breathlessness to explore these fears. Are you worried about something? Are you anxious? Is there something that is bothering you? How much are you able to walk? What is it that you're not able to do? How has breathlessness affected your life? So, there are certain questions which actually will bring so many different things that the patient is thinking about. But we are not trained to ask that. And even if we ask, we don't know what else to do for the patient. So, here today, you will learn what else you can do for these patients. Any questions, Sunil?
No, no, I don't see any
Okay.
such question.
Okay, so coming to this comes for this is the time for me to introduce you to this syndrome called as chronic breathlessness syndrome, which was actually published by after international Delphi concluded. So, what is important for you to remember is chronic breathlessness syndrome is an entity when patients are breathless 24/7, 365 days a year, despite being on optimum medical treatment for their underlying condition, which is COPD, ILD, cardiac failure, whatever that may be. Patient is already on the maximum treatment for that and still continues to feel breathless. This breathlessness actually affects his activities of daily living, affects him adversely psychosocially. And therefore, these are the patients who actually need the help and support of palliative care physicians. So, what can we do for these patients? A lot can be done, which is non pharmacological. So, starting with, of course, exploring the patient's values, fears, anxiety. What is it that's bothering you? Are you worried about something? Are you coping? Is your family coping with your condition? Second thing is positioning. Certain people feel better propped up, certain people feel better with hunched up, right lateral, left lateral. It's important for the patient to be in a open space, open air, next to a window. Pre-COVID era, we also spoke about fan blowing on the face. For COVID patients, we do not recommend that fan blowing because it can spread aerosols. But these are some things that you can do. Loose clothing, certain massages, certain music therapy, certain breathing techniques that the physiotherapy can use. So these are various other techniques. So you can involve a counselor, you can involve a physiotherapist, you can involve social workers, you can involve a lot of people, multidisciplinary approach to actually help these patients. So pharmacology, non-pharmacological support is quite a bit. Very often we also ask patients to meet other patients of COPD or other patients of interstitial lung disease who can actually exchange ideas of what can be done if you are suddenly breathless. So there is a lot that we can do with non-pharmacology. And with pharmacology, depending on the patient's underlying condition, we can use steroids, increase the dose of bronchodilators, or switch from inhalers to nebulizer, prescribe the patient oxygen if this oxygen saturation is maintained below 88, because we need a minimal saturation of 88 to 92 for the optimum functioning of the brain, the kidney, the heart, etc. In certain conditions where there is fibrosis, antifibrotics, and of course, the non-invasive treatment we give is BiPAP, the non-invasive ventilator. But one drug which is not given enough respect in these conditions is morphine. Morphine is a wonder drug for patients who have chronic breathlessness, who are already on optimum treatment for all their medications and still continue to be breathless. And these are patients who are breathless at rest or on very minimal exertion. So morphine is used in a very, very small dose. We usually start with 2.5 milligrams twice a day and slowly titrate it according to the patient needs. We rarely go beyond 25 to 30 milligrams. And this helps in the decreasing of the sensation of breathless. Patient feels less breathless. It doesn't alter the lung function. It doesn't alter the anatomy of the lung. It only makes the patient breathe easier, lower respiratory rate. It doesn't worsen the hypercapnia, and it does not cause respiratory depression in the doses used as I told before. So it's a very, very safe medication. It's an extremely effective medication for those patients who are bedbound, housebound, and whose lives are very frustrated, like how probably a lot of us experienced during the pandemic when we were forced to stay in the house. These patients with a low dose morphine can actually manage to do small things. So there are patients of mine who come back and tell me, thank you, today I went to the toilet on my own, even if it was once, but I managed to do it on my own. Or I went to the dining table and had a meal with the rest of my family. Or I was able to sit on the wheelchair, go down, and at least go and talk to my friends for a few minutes without coughing or without being breathless. So these are small pleasures for those patients who can't even do that much. These are small victories to improve their quality of life, which is what we are focused on in palliative care. We need to improve the patient's quality of life, make his suffering a little less, see to it that he gets joy in small things that he wishes to do. The important thing is you must prescribe laxatives, like you have already been told with pain, because our patients with chronic breathlessness cannot afford to be constipated, and these patients get very uncomfortable trying to strain to pass stools. We titrate these doses weekly and slowly increase it. So it's a start low, go slow. Very, very important thing to realize, to remember that morphine can be used and should be used in patients who are chronically breathless. In those patients with COVID fibrosis and who requiring a lot of oxygen, despite all medications, we have used morphine in a lot of these conditions to offer comfort to the patient and give the patient the dignity and respect he deserves. Is there a question, Sunil? Yeah. In post TB with extensive fibrosis, can it be used? I assume that you're talking about morphine. Yes. So, if what I'm trying to tell you is please, you have to identify your patients who are chronically breathless. So if the breathlessness, the cause could be anything. It can be post TB, it can be COPD, it can be COVID. The point is that you are already given the patient optimum treatment for the underlying pathophysiology. And when the patient continues to be breathless, please do start a very, very tiny dose of morphine and see the difference, because morphine also cuts the anxiety. Morphine decreases the respiratory rate and the work of breathing. So all those patients who fit into chronic breathlessness and post TB extensive fibrosis definitely does, because these patients are very, very breathless despite being on all medications. So this is just a simple flow chart to think about how to start the morphine and the various ways that you can give
There is
morphine.
there
Yeah,
is one question.
yeah.
Are there any contraindications?
So, for comfort care, there isn't any contraindication. The one contraindication is probably renal. If the patient has a renal problem, then you don't give the morphine as frequently as you would like. But there isn't any contraindication, especially if you have communicated well and documented why you're giving morphine, and the fact that these patients with morphine, suppose you give them an extra dose, they can probably be a little more drowsy. So therefore, if you have experiencing drowsiness, you can ask the patient to cut back on the morphine. Other than that, there is no contraindication. Sunil, would you want to add to that?
No, I think that's correct because the morphine is excreted through kidney. So we usually, but in considering Indian situation, sometimes we are forced to use morphine, and because many of the palliative care units doesn't have any other um, opioids with which we can control the breathlessness.
Yeah, so
So
what Sunil
even
is trying to say is that we don't have hydroxymorphine, we don't have all the other medications available in the West. The whole purpose of giving morphine is comfort and improving quality of life. Therefore, there are no contraindications except the creatinine. There's some other comment here. Most of the advanced lung CA with pain already are taking correct. Those are for the pain, and therefore it is important to remember again that in pain, the doses of morphine are much higher, but in respiratory conditions with breathlessness, we start really slow, we increase it slow, and we review it weekly. So it's not the same, but yes, it can be used in those patients. So thank you for that comment. And also, we need to remember that there's a lot of opioid phobia amongst doctors, amongst patients, and amongst family. So therefore, we need to be very, very sure. What do we do with renal? Arsha has asked. Renal failure. So if with it's not, if suppose you have patients on with renal failure and they're on dialysis, you can give the morphine pre-dialysis. There's no problem. You can also increase the frequency that you give. Instead of giving 4 hourly, you can make it 8 hourly depending on the creatinine and the creatinine clearance. But there's another medication which is more complicated to use, like methadone. Methadone is another drug that can be used even in respiratory failure. And Sunil is a champion of calculating methadone doses. It's a little complicated the way you give methadone, because the half life of methadone is 1 week. So it's a little more difficult drug, but with morphine on dialysis, it's safe to give it before the dialysis, or you just increase the frequency and reduce the dose for an effect. So it's not that it is contraindicated, it just needs to be given much more carefully. Okay, so if there's no other question, I'm happy to go on. But thank you. It always helps to have an interactive session. So do ask questions. Okay, so this is the thing that you can give morphine orally, you can give it intravenously, you can give it subcutaneously. There are also a lot of patches available, but we would strongly, palliative care physicians would strongly recommend the use of oral or intravenous or a subcutaneous parenteral morphine rather than the patch, because patch is much more expensive. In a tropical country like India, when there is so much of humidity and sweating, we really don't know how well the patch works. The patch takes 12 hours to kick in the morphine into the system. And once on the patch, and if the patient develops more symptoms, we really are not sure how how much is the circulating morphine to be able to confidently give the patient more morphine. In patients where we are controlling the amount of morphine we give, we can easily decide that it is 3 hours or it is 2 hours in the earlier dose of morphine, and we can titrate the dose according to what the patient has received, and there is a lot of control of the amount of morphine in the circulation. Whenever we think that the patient has a lot of anxiety, we do add a medium acting benzodiazepine. And when the patient is panicking, we put midazolam. So I think there's another comment here. Will it help to reduce the so please remember that bronchodilator's mechanism of action and the way it acts by attaching to the beta receptors as well as the muscarinic receptors is a completely different way. So we need to continue the existing medications for the underlying pathophysiology. So bronchodilators work differently. They allow air to come in and go out. Morphine works differently. So it really doesn't help to decrease the dose of the bronchodilator. Patient should be on. Yeah, Sunil, I meant the buprenorphine, the artificial patches, transdermal patches available, the fentanyl patches which are available, which a lot of people keep asking about for patients with breathlessness. And we must use it with caution. It's not a good idea to use it as freely as the pharma industry would like us to use it. Okay. So, like I said, there's a lot of phobia. People think that they're going to die if they've been given morphine. People think, why are you giving me morphine? I've not got pain, or I've not got cancer to take morphine. So, please remember that we need to get rid of these myths about morphine, and we need to learn about the pharmacodynamics of morphine so that we are comfortable prescribing it. And if you see the results of morphine on patients who are so breathless, it really means a world to them. It makes a world of difference because their demand and their need is so little, and morphine really helps them improve their quality of life. So it's a wonder drug, and there is enough evidence to suggest that it is causes good improvement in quality of life, does not cause respiratory depression, and does not cause the carbon dioxide to rise. So, especially in those patients of terminal breathlessness. For example, today I've just come from an ICU seeing an 84-year-old patient with post-COVID. So he's had COVID, he's got had bilateral pneumonia, which has now healed by fibrosis, but unfortunately he's still requiring 100% oxygen, not maintaining his saturation, restless. Obviously, the family is restless, patient is tachypnic. So for such patients, when there's distressing symptoms, we use a continuous infusion of morphine as well as midazolam, and we usually give it subcutaneous, which is the preferred route in palliative medicine, which causes least pain over 24 hours so that the patient is comfortable. But what is very, very important is to explain to the family what you are doing, why you're doing it, and take their signature, because patient is not responsive once we start the patient on morphine and midazolam. He remains sedated and he transitions or ends life in a very peaceful manner in his sleep. So it's very important to aggressively assess the patient, explain to the family, document it, get their signature before you use this kind of a 24-hour infusion, because it is important for them to realize that this act of giving them this 24-hour infusion is to give them comfort. It is in their best interest, and it also helps them transition smoothly. So it's very important that in terminal breathlessness, we do use morphine. Many anesthetists almost always, I think, have ICUs where they use fentanyl. But I think in terminal breathlessness, morphine and midazolam combination helps a lot. So this is something that we call as palliative sedation, which is basically aggressive treatment of terminal breathlessness. So there are some palliative care physicians who don't want to talk about palliative. They just say that you need to control symptoms aggressively towards end of life to maintain a good quality of life till death. So it's not to hasten death. The intent is comfort care. The intent is only in the patient's best interest. So there's a question from Radha. Any model palliative assessment form or consent form? So if you look at the web, Radha, there are many from the West, but we really need to adapt it to our own culture. Usually, what we do is that we explain to the patient, take the negative consents for escalation of care, which includes hydration, nutrition, dialysis, fluid resuscitation. So, RT feeds, each of those is specifically mentioned, as well as cross cardiopulmonary resuscitation, as well as intubation. So and in the COVID times, this has also changed because the family is away from the patient. So we are actually asking them to send us WhatsApp video images of their consent that they do not want to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So things are changing. Yes, I think we should have a regular consent form for all hospitals, but it is different in different regions and different countries. Therefore, I think what is important is to spend effective time with the patient's family, communicate with them, and get your necessary signatures before you embark on any such. Because very often the family can also say, you gave us this medicine and the patient died. But that's not the point. The patient was to die anyway. You just made the journey more comfortable. So, any more questions? Can I go on? Because a
Yeah,
lot
that was
of
the question.
patients with breathlessness also have secretions, and very often I'm sure you have seen people who do suction, and very often patients with stroke etc are sent home by giving suction. So this is something which is extremely cruel, and it can be very painful for the patient, and there's a lot of ulceration etc in the pharyngeal walls. So therefore another good way of palliating these secretions is to decrease the secretions by using hyoscine or glycopyrrolate in the dose of 2 to 4, zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.4, 20 to 40 micrograms. Again, we can give it subcutaneously. We watch for over dehydration, but it works very well to decrease the secretions, thereby avoiding suction. So please remember, there are medications, and this is the beauty of palliative care, how pharmacotherapy can be adjusted in such a way that it helps patients in certain manner where harsher techniques can be avoided. Okay. Moving on from breathlessness to another distressing symptom, which is cough, which is a normal protective reflex. And I think I'm overshooting the time, so I'll rush through these other symptoms. So it's important for you to remember that cough can, especially persistent cough, can be extremely distressing. And again, cough is not just respiratory, it could be gastric because of reflux, cardiac, again, failure, certain drugs, radiation, as well as psychogenic. So anytime you remember, you have to have a detailed history, kind of cough, diurnal variation, color of the sputum, dry cough, wet cough, go through the drug chart, do everything. And once you establish that you have sorted all the other reasons for the cough, you then need to focus on the fact that the patient has chronic intractable cough. So there are certain non-pharmacological things that you can ask the patient to do, which is sometimes patients for respiratory, like physiotherapists can teach them breathing exercise. There are certain acupressure points for cough, or you can also optimize their treatment, check their technique for the inhalers, explore their worries. There are certain few medications that you can use. For example, the common things we do use is gabapentin for intractable cough. We can also use, if the etiology of the cough is, say, anxiety, then citalopram can be used. But morphine also is a drug that can be used if codeine doesn't work. So you can use gabapentin for intractable cough. You can use codeine syrups, and the next step is to use morphine. So please do remember, your evaluation will lead you to this conclusion of a chronic intractable cough. Once you have chronic intractable cough, you can try these medications. Start with gabapentin, then to codeine, then to morphine, low dose, just like in breathlessness, to see to it that you can keep the patient comfortable. Now, the next symptom, again, for lack of time, I will definitely go through it, but please remember, pleural effusion, which we see very often in malignant situations, can be an extremely distressing symptom because the fluid keeps filling up. And this can be very distressing to the patient. And in a COVID situation, again, patient can't keep coming to aspirate this fluid. So you must remember that the management of recurrent filling pleural effusion or malignant pleural effusion is directly dependent on the cause. So if the patient is usually pleural effusions are seen in metastatic cancers. So if the patient has a good prognosis, then we put the patient on a pigtail or an indwelling catheter, and we dry out the pleura and then can attempt a permanent solution called as the pleurodesis. But if the patient doesn't have a good prognosis, then we aspirate large quantities, say 1 to 2 liters, and uh, therefore we see to it that those patients are kept comfortable, but they don't have a long-term indwelling catheter. So depending on the prognosis of the patient, we keep the patient comfortable. Believe me, even those patients who are got pleural effusion, who are breathless and cannot remove much fluid, you can still give them low dose morphine along with interventions like aspiration. So it depends on the cause. Malignant pleural effusion also depends on the severity, the performance status of the patient, and therefore how much it responds to drainage. Then we come to hemoptysis, which can be another distressing symptom, and hemoptysis can cause death by exsanguination, that is loss of blood, or asphyxiation, because a large volume of blood, if aspirated into the lung, can be very, very fatal. And it can also be very scary, commonly seen in our country post TB, as well as, of course, cancer and infections. And therefore, in a situation where you are dealing with a patient of bronchogenic CA, or if it's very close to a big vessel, you need to be prepared and to prepare the patient and the family of how it can be, and tell them it's important how to reassure the patient. It's important to keep dark towels and not white color towels or light color towels, because the sight of blood itself can be very, very scary. Also, the interventions we can do, especially if it's a bronchogenic CA, we can do laser, we can do cryo, we can do brachytherapy and endobronchial radiation. Commonly, what we do offer, which is external, is bronchial artery embolization, which is done by radiologists, where a gel foam is inserted into the branch of the bronchial artery so that the end of the bronchial artery can actually be clotted so that there's no more loss of blood. So there are many things that we can do even if we can't cure a patient. And that is what is important for us to remember as the mantra of palliative care, that even if you can't cure, you can comfort and care for the patient. And it's extremely important for us to realize that it doesn't mean it's an extra waste of time. If you ask the right questions, you can actually try and help the patient. Of course, you must realize that we also have limitations and we cannot solve all their issues, but at least we can hear it, and at least we are able to address it, acknowledge that yes, it must be distressing. Yes, we are here to support you. And that is what exactly palliative care does. And what do we do in the medical management of hemoptysis? We can use these medications, especially tranexamic acid, which can be given orally as well as endobronchoscopically so that the bleeding can stop. So we use tranexamic acid often to control hemoptysis. The last is the hiccups, which actually could be argued that it is a gastrointestinal symptom, but it can be very, very distressing. And commonly it is seen because of acidity and reflux. So we do use, earlier, I remember as an postgraduate, we used to put Ryle's tube and neutralize the acid with bicarbonates. The other things that you can do is try using proton pump inhibitors, prokinetics, so that the stomach empties. Also, we can use gabapentin agonists, agonists like baclofen, and metoclopramide can be used for intractable hiccups. So some others, of course, there are non-pharmacological interventions like distracting the patients or scaring the patients or certain respiratory maneuvers, which actually help the patient. So I've just given you an overall, but my main focus has been to introduce you to the need for palliative care in respiratory conditions, the term chronic breathlessness syndrome that most of our patients with advanced lung diseases experience, how morphine in a low dose, start low, go slow, can be safely and effectively used to control the distressing symptoms of breathlessness. And what is most important for us is to recognize when these patients of advanced lung diseases need to be interacted and discussed about palliative care. Very often it is left for too late, and we really need to start integrating palliative care into all specialties. So that was my main aim. Sorry, I have been a little tardy and taken more of your time, but I'm over to Sunil for the case and the next session.
Okay, thank you, madam. So I think, yeah, there is a question. Doses of anti-secretaries at both orally and
Yeah, so it's very simple. Hyoscine, you will get it in the prescription. Hyoscine is zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.4, and glycopyrrolate is 20 to 40 micrograms. You can give it as SOS, check for the hydration, I mean the number of secretions, and then you can also give the second dose. Usually we give it BD, or sometimes we use it on need basis also. This can be used for respiratory secretions, especially those patients who have a lot of amount of secretions, and if even post stroke patients who have aspirated, they also you can use hyoscine or glycopyrrolate.
madam, I think you just got it reversed, the doses.
Oh, sorry,
Glycopyrrolate is
20 to 4.
yeah.
Hyoscine is
Yeah.
20 to 40. Sorry, thank you for pointing out. And glycopyrrolate is 0.2 to zero point 0.4. Yes, thanks, Sunil. You are the pharmacology expert. So, is who's presenting the case today? We are having a case, right?
Yeah, madam. But before that, we have some time for questions. Is there any
Vinayak is
justification
asking.
for measures
Yeah.
like form oxygen that can improve survival,
So,
but
with
not
this,
in
yeah,
yeah.
but not necessarily discomfort for conditions like COPD. So, in COPD, a lot of patients are on home oxygen because they're not able to maintain their saturation between 88 and 92. And it is important for our patients to maintain the oxygen levels between 88 and 92 for optimal functions of others. So there is a detailed evaluation done by pulmonologists prescribing the long-term oxygen therapy at home. So there is justification to provide home oxygen, because without it is definitely going to prolong survival, but it is not at the cost of quality of life. So it is not that the patients are not able to do anything. These patients, for example, in the West, we have patients who are on portable oxygen, and they go to play golf, or they go for a walk, or they go for a holiday. So it's not, these patients are able to do small things in life. It's not that they're complete respiratory cripple. So obviously you have to balance with what the patient wants, what he can do, and what you can offer, because the focus is quality of life. We need to we are not talking about improving survival. There are enough evidence to suggest that long term oxygen therapy also decreases hospitalizations. It also decreases the ICU stay. So these patients don't end up in casualty that often. It keeps them outside the hospital. So that also improves quality of life and doesn't burden the health system. At the same time, it also offers the patient decent quality of life. We will not do we will not prescribe oxygen to all and sundry. At the same time, oxygen is only kept given to those patients to keep them comfortable, not to prolong their life.
Madam, can you describe what is pulmonary rehabilitation?
Sure. So, pulmonary rehabilitation is an extremely important side of treatment offered to patients with advanced lung disease. So, just like pharmacotherapy, pulmonary rehabilitation is an important arm, because what it does is it's a program which is run by respiratory physiotherapists over a period of 6 to 10 weeks. So typically, those patients who have COPD or who have interstitial lung disease, the more active they are, the better they are emotionally, psychologically, and physically. The more muscles they use, the diaphragm also remains strong. The more breathing exercise they do, what happens is the amount of expired air increases, because the main problem in airway disease is a loss of elasticity. And once the elasticity is lost, expiration is hampered. So therefore, every breath, they are retaining more and more of residual volume. Therefore, by learning breathing techniques, they are increasing their expiratory capacity, they're increasing the stamina of the respiratory muscles, and they're also increasing uh, their own stamina. For example, tomorrow, if I am told to run half a marathon, 21 kilometers, and I start running, I will faint in the first kilometer. So I have to train myself to run the marathon. For these patients of advanced lung disease, going to the toilet, going down for a walk is a marathon for them. It's like climbing Everest. So they have to train. And pulmonary rehab focuses on exactly that. It's a group activity. They see other patients, they give graded exercises. Slowly, they increase the strength and the repetitions of the exercise. They also do the exercise on oxygen so that the muscles do not undergo anaerobic metabolism. At the same time, what they also teach the patient is breathing techniques. They train the patients to use their shoulder as a good fulcrum, because all accessory muscles of respiration use the shoulder joint. So the upper arm exercises are focused upon. So it's a very scientific approach of making the patient stronger, improving the stamina, and utilizing the normal lung function to its optimum, because a large part of the lung is already affected. But whatever is available, they make that much more strong so that patient is able to carry out activities of daily living with as less discomfort and as independently as possible. So it really gives a worth to a patient's life. So every doctor for every specialty must talk of rehab. For example, post ortho, post surgery, post elderly patients who are admitted to ICU. All these people need to be rehabilitated because they lose a lot of muscle, they lose a lot of confidence, stamina, just by become post-op or post-hospitalization. And these patients, it's very, very important to discuss with your physiotherapist about pulmonary rehab if you have an advanced lung condition patient. Mahesh Mohta has written, we need an OPD evaluation page in detail for respiratory system breathing exercise in detail. Yes. And also how all these things affect the patient's life. Very important. Yes, of course. For post-stroke patients, what are the indications for planning to close tracheostomy if time permits? Please guide, ma'am. So tracheostomy closure should be again not done at home. It should be done in the hospital. And usually what we do is we keep decreasing the size of the tracheostomy tube till we come to the smallest, so that we are sure that the patient breathes on his own. So of course the indications are the alertness of the patient, how much he's able to maintain his airways, how much he's able to swallow so that the secretions are there, and also the speech therapy that goes on side by side with tracheostomy. So usually we decannulate the patient by using smaller sizes, but it also depends on the overall improvement of the patient. And usually we talk about a removal of tracheostomy only if, one, we know that there is no improve going to be any use of the tracheostomy, or two, we know if the patient is really going to not survive even with the tracheostomy. So very important to decide when, and that also depends on how well the patient has improved from the stroke. Having said that, in today's time, when there is palliative care approach, you really need to talk to patient and relatives before doing the tracheostomy in a stroke patient. So if you have poor survival, why would you do the tracheostomy? So the whole point is selection of your patient for tracheostomy. So I might be digressing a bit, but in the day and age, with your knowledge of palliative care, think before you do these procedures, because it can be very difficult for them sending the patient home or looking after the patient at home, and it might become an indication for the patient to be institutionalized. So I hope that answers your question, Sudha. Vinayak, digression on a doubt about pulmonary rehab. A lot of patients who got CT thorax done during the early months of the pandemic were seen to have minimal atelectasis, correct, but were not symptomatic. Can you, things you mentioned, pulmonary also be used prophylactic? So, that pulmonary rehab is not something that we do prophylactically. Pulmonary rehab is done when you establish a diagnosis of COPD or ILD or any chronic respiratory illness. While what you could do prophylactically is your pranayam, your breathing exercise, or any exercise. So for healthy people, there's no prophylactic pulmonary rehab. For healthy people, you should indulge yourself in any exercise that increases the cardiorespiratory rate. So running, jogging, swimming, cycling, badminton, tennis, something that improves your stamina of the lung. Secondly, what you also can do is pranayama. So all the yoga techniques that helps in breathing, that helps in maintaining the elasticity of your lung, improves the stamina of your lung. Pulmonary rehab, when you talk of rehab, it's all obviously something is compromised and therefore you're rehabilitating. But when you're talking of prevention, it is these exercises. So okay, so you're talking of the fact that the atelectasis. Now, the point is, when a patient has had symptoms and has had CT features of COVID or the sequelae of COVID, yes, those patients must be sent for routine physiotherapy and stamina building exercises for the lung. So what I'm trying to say is, the all patients, so these are not normal people, they are people who have been affected by the COVID and they have some abnormality in the CT. Yes, they should be taken into pulmonary rehab. Have I explained you properly, Vinayak, or have I not understood you? Thanks.
Okay. So I think we can move on to patient story, which will be presented by Dr. Arsha. Dr. Arsha.
Yes. Um, Hello. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Arsha. I'm a dentist.
Hi.
Uh, uh, right now, I'm not here. This is a story of my mother. She passed away in September. So I thought this, she actually for a long time, she suffered with breathlessnesses and all. So I thought it would be a good case presentation. Anyway, so she was a 58-year-old female. She was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease, stage 5 hypertension, and post transplant renal failure was there. Next time. The presenting complaint which she had was dyspnea, with breathlessness, and pain in the upper left back and chest region, nausea, and vomiting. Okay, if I give a little bit of history of her, this thing, she was diagnosed with renal failure in 2019.
Dr. Harsha?
Because of her problems with dialysis, she was not able to sustain dialysis. Within 5 months, she started showing signs of rejections. For that, she was frequently admitted in hospital for her anti-rejection treatments. In June 2019 onwards, she started showing signs of, symptoms of breathlessness, which when we showed it to them, they said it is because of the pleural effusion. She's going into again renal failure. And so whenever she was there were episodes of hospitalization where when she was admitted. Hello?
Arsha, we lost you.
I'm sorry, there is a slight problem with the internet connection over here. We have an
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah, please go on. Now
Am
we can
I
hear.
am I audible at present?
Yeah, yeah, please.
Okay. So yeah, which was so then because of pleural effusion, she underwent dialysis. Like once she was admitted, she will undergo dialysis for 1 or 2 hours, and then she'll come back. And the nephrologist way we don't need dialysis like that way. In She has 2 months long stay in October 2019 with the same case of breathlessness. Even after having dialysis, she was not her breathlessness was not getting better. So at that time we did 2D echo, and she was diagnosed as aortic valve stenosis, where her LVF efficiency was 60% only, and she had a very big cardiomegaly. Next slide. So And given her present state that her creatinine was around 5, her creatinine was around 7, the doctor said she's not a good candidate for open heart surgery. And we decided to go for TAVR, that is trans aortic valve replacement, in December 2019. And though we were all informed that TAVR is also not a very good option for her because of the dye which they inject, it will kind of it will kind of deteriorate her renal function, as well as since she's a post transplant patient, she was already immunocompromised, she was on corticosteroids and all mycoimmune and tacrolimus drugs, so there was a risk of infections. But anyway, we went with the TAVR because without TAVR it was very difficult for her to even get up from the bed and go to the washrooms, do her daily activities, and thinking that resolving the aortic stenosis will help her, we went with that. So after TAVR, her renal functions, as said, it deteriorated. She became completely anuric. And then again, she started having recurrent episodes of hospitalization due to breathlessness, which was given with pleural effusion, which went on to have pneumonia because of Klebsiella pneumonia, which was hospital acquired. So on 22nd August 2013, she was admitted again with the complaints of breathlessness and pain in her upper back, sternal region, nausea and vomiting. She during this all time, like from 2018 onwards, she has a deteriorating lung because of pleural effusions, and she was obese. She was around 85 90 kgs because of her steroids and treatment. So she was on BiPAP. So mostly her lung conditions were weakened again. Next slide. So on examination, when she was admitted on 22nd August 2020, she was afebrile, she was pale, but her blood pressure was on lower side. Her HB was 6.8, SpO2 75, PCV 24.8, RBC 2.5. And the thing was, they find out she has increased serum lipase and serum amylase, which were later on to pancreatitis, acute pancreatitis. So for which she was put on Ryle's tube, and she was next slide. Okay. So, and for her investigations, which there were this chest X-ray, pleural effusion, and there was interstitial patches. There were HRCT, chest done, which showed bilateral pleural effusion, interstitial edema, cardiomegaly, dilated pulmonary artery, which was suggestive of pulmonary hypertension. The Dopplers again showed after this is post TAVR, so she had the aortic stenosis was there, but she started having mild mitral regurgitations and all. So during this is the history with during her stay. After her acute pancreatitis, she went on to develop further infections. Like she started deteriorating. She became after 2 days she became disoriented and totally sedated, and all her GCS scale dropped. And then she started showing signs of sepsis. Towards the end, like by 10 September and all, they diagnosed her with candidemia, and she was into full sepsis. And they started her on mycamin injections, but she was not responding.
Dr. Arsha?
NET, that non-explanation of treatment, as well as hello.
Doctor, we lost you in between. We could hear only she was started using mycamin injection.
Yeah, she started using mycamin injection. They gave her twice. They gave her 2 dosages of mycamin injections, but since she was not responding to the treatment, uh, we we are we asked them not to put her on ventilator. She was already on NIV. We said whatever is, just give her maintenance treatment, whatever treatment is required, just give her. There is no explanation of treatment. We asked her not to do dialysis also for her. Next slide. So if I was psychosocial aspects, they belong to a middle class family. Husband is a pensioner, she's a nurse, but she's not yet started. She has a 24-year-old son who is working in a private sector, not yet married, and he's a married daughter. The only few words she said in her last week was to go home alive and see her granddaughter, since she was admitted in the ICU, and her granddaughter was not allowed. She's just 4 years old. Children were not allowed in the ICU. But with sepsis and dialysis as main concerns, the decisions got delayed. Like the doctors were not willing to send her home given her condition of sepsis, and dialysis was a main issue. Later, the hospital was not willing to discharge her given her worsened state. So we asked them, family member, we don't want her to discharge her under LAMA because of insurance reasons. So towards the last days, she just wanted to stay here with children, but ICU has a protocol. So we did get a special permission to stay for longer duration, and we could allow video calls so that she could she could just see her mother. So she was not fully oriented, but she just used to open her eyes. Like if you, she used to respond on pain. So like if you call her or pinch her, she would just open her eyes and then she will close her eyes. So later we signed NET and DNR, and this was the helpless state of her family members when we can't even fulfill her last wishes, that she wanted to come back home and we could not bring her alive because of the protocols and the policies. Next slide. So these are the medications that she were on: meropenem, injection polymyxin, mycamine, Rifagot, 550 mg, Pantocid, Tramadol, Lesurite, Sevelamer. I think she was not on morphine because I don't know. After this session, I came to know that she would have a better, less painful time if we would have given her morphine. She was on dialysis, which was weekly thrice, and we towards the end, that the last week of her life, we asked her not to give dialysis because dialysis was very painful for her. So we said not to do dialysis also. Next slide. So the main concern for the patient was dyspnea. Like towards the end of the day, even she was on NIV, she was breathless. And this was the main problem which she had from 2018 onwards, her breathlessness. Earlier, it was due to pleural effusion due to dialysis. And then afterwards, it went on to have infections. And then she had a cardiac component also coming into it. So whenever she was at home, the thing which concerned us was that should we have taken her home for a frequent hospitalization, because majority of her infections she got was nosocomial infections, whether it is candidemia or nosocomial and all. So that is the one concern which I had, like if this breathlessness could have been managed at home if she had been on a palliative care or something, because towards the end she died of sepsis. Next slide. So 58-year-old female with history of CKD stage 5, hypertension, post-TAVR, post-transplant patient, comes with severe dyspnea, acute pancreatitis, and during her month-long stay in hospital, she developed sepsis. Next. So this is a thing. So the things which bothers me was, we know that she was immunocompromised. Still, we went for TAVR. So was TAVR a right decision for her? Because sometimes I feel maybe because of TAVR, her things were, hastened. Like we were told that TAVR may die will be reducing, she will be prone to infections and all. So, and we had a very good counseling also at that time, but still we thought that is better and we went ahead. So this is the one question I had, whether TAVR was a right option for her. And second is, there was frequent hospitalization in past 6 months due to breathlessness, which was later resolved by dialysis. So had palliative care been given, would there have been any change in the outcome? And with palliative care, was it possible to maintain her at home?
Can we stop the screen sharing, Rajalakshmi? First of all, Arsha, thank you very much for sharing that story. It is not easy to talk about one's parent going through such a traumatic experience. It is very, very difficult. So thank you, and I hope you and your family are okay. It's just listening to the story was giving me so much um, visual amount of stress that you and your family went through, not just physically but emotionally, psychologically, financially. It's like you said, it's not at all easy, and plus so much of suffering for all of you. So big hug to you, Arsha, and take care. It's must have been a very, very traumatic thing. So first of all, there are few things that are takeaways that we can all learn from this. Yes, it is very difficult to talk about your own loved one's illness. Having said that, it is very important for us as doctors. You can see that even Arsha is a dentist, to realize how much a family goes through when somebody is suffering. So, therefore, when you talk to a patient and the family, it is very important to empathize with what that particular patient and family, why are they asking these questions? What does it mean? Second thing is to explain to them, because you're the specialist in that particular area, what exactly they can expect, meaning the trajectory of the illness. It is very important to be honest. And secondly, like for example, I am a chest specialist. I have seen X number of COPDs, X number of ILDs. It is therefore my onus to foresee and forewarn the family and patients that this is how your trajectory or the natural course of your illness is going to be. It may not be that, but prepare them for what might be in store for the future. Once you do that, it is then the onus, you have actually explained to them what this illness is going to be. Therefore, the patient and the family has enough time to sit and discuss what is right and what is wrong. For example, yes, Arsha's mother was very young. 58 is very, very young in the 21st century. But unfortunately, she had stage 5 CKD. Stage 5 CKD, Arsha, is incurable. I'm not sure whether the renal doctor told you that in so many words, because sometimes truth is so bitter. The doctors are scared to tell the patients this because it's going to open a Pandora's box of emotions. But you must realize this is very important from your own experience. If you had been told, or if you had understood well, that CKD stage 5 is incurable, you might not have done all those procedures for your mother. Second thing, even after you did, we cannot rewind things. There is nothing right, nothing wrong. You did what you thought was in the best interest of your mother. Every stage, from what I understood, palliative care intervention would have opened your options. You would have been given other options that you could have thought of. So I think typically what we say is, in palliative care, the integration of palliative care should be early. How early? So if you feel that this patient has had recurrent issues, like your mother had recurrent breathlessness, recurrent hospital, that is the time to integrate palliative care. A lot could have been done at home. A lot of the aggressive medical treatment could have been avoided at home. So I think, honestly speaking, our doctors are poorly trained in the concepts and principles of palliative care. Everybody thinks palliative care is giving up. It is not so. It is improving the quality of life. We palliative care physicians are pro life. Now, the memory that you have of your mother is being alone in ICU, being struggling, suffering. Instead of that, if she was surrounded by her family, the loved ones, kept comfortable, it would have been a much different memory that you have. It's not easy losing a loved one, especially a mother, and especially so young. It is very traumatic experience. But palliative care could have really made a difference, could have supported you and your family, and the suffering for your mother would have decreased. I feel her breathlessness was multifold. It was CKD, it was pleural effusion, it was cardiac. So therefore, since none of these were completely curable, aggressive symptomatic treatment would have really kept her comfortable. But I'm really very sorry for your loss. And it's really very brave of you to be able to speak in a forum where you really don't know any of us. But Arsha, would you like to ask any more questions? And would you want to add to what I said, Sunil?
Yeah, let's hear from our
Ma'am, I would like to know is like the first thing which really the reason I went into I came into palliative was this because of the hospital. This thing, like I really want her to come back. There were issues of lama and protocols and all, and I had no idea about all these things. I knew about palliative because of working in mission hospitals, but in bigger setups, it is not there. So the
Yes.
one thing which I would love to know is what is the protocol for bigger tertiary setups in city hospitals where the patient we know she's not going to survive. So is there a protocol like that, that the things
So
which is already
what I
written?
can what I can tell you is medico-legally, the Supreme Court of India, in the judgment of March 2019, has allowed patient and its family to refuse treatment. The right to refuse treatment is with the patient. Now, what happens, unfortunately, in corporate hospitals, rich cannot come out and the poor cannot go in. In corporate hospitals, they arm twist you in such a way saying, you I cannot give you discharge, you have to take discharge, and discharge against medical advice is the worst thing that can happen to patients because that increases the torture and suffering the most. The idea is, why have we become doctors? We have become doctors to address suffering, to acknowledge and support a good person who is struggling with his physical ailments. For example, what have we misconstrued it as? That health is physical health. Even WHO's definition of health is not just the mere absence of disease, it is overall well-being. Are we focused on that? Most of the corporate hospitals are focused on revenue generation. Most of the corporate hospitals want to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's like the patient being on a conveyor belt. If this doesn't work, next. If this doesn't work, next. If this doesn't work, next. They don't sit and think, because none of us in the medical training are trained in palliative care. We are not trained in medical ethics, and we are not trained to talk. We are a profession which is closest to death, dying, and suffering. Yet, the doctors are the worst communicators. We really need to learn the art of talking, because honestly speaking, from the beginning, CKD stage 5 has a very poor prognosis. That patient should have been let to do all that she wants to do. For example, it's like telling a stage 4 cancer patient, try this chemo, try this radio, spend the last few months of your life in hospital. It Unless you as doctors explain to the patient and family the futility, the inappropriateness of advanced aggressive medical treatment, how are patients and family going to make a decision that we will not do it? So doctors don't part with information, patients don't ask for information, and in that whole thing, patient is the one who's enduring so much suffering, which is why we really need to focus on the fact that as responsible doctors, knowing the trajectory of the illness, we should sit down and explain to the patient and family, let them think about what is good and what is bad, and let them make the decision. Autonomy is the first pillar of medical ethics. Let the patient decide. In India, it is always, in my experience, this works, so we will do it. It might not. What is food for me is poison for somebody else. Let the person decide what is good for the person, so that we can give what is person centered care and shared decision making. It is not you who is going to endure that treatment, it is a patient. So we have to be honest with the patient. We here are worried about time. I have 50 more patients in the OPD, but not all patients are in the same boat. So it's very important, because really, Arsha, this is exactly the reason I have entered palliative care, the way I lost my father. Nobody else should suffer the way you do. So hats off to you for channelizing this knowledge into a positive energy to help others. But just see our medical system. It is really corroded. It is focused on money. It is not focused on suffering. It is not focused on helping another individual. And especially now in the wake of the COVID pandemic, all the more reason we need to give each other, be kind, compassionate, and empathetic, because it's very, very sad to see one thing after the other. And Lama, I think, is the worst thing that can happen to a family. Yes, Sunil.
Yeah. So after how long they leave after starting the dialysis?
Sir, she after post transplant, after 2019, she started on dialysis in January 2020,
Mm-hmm.
and she passed away in September 19. So could say it's
Okay.
just 6 months, 7 months she was on
But
dialysis.
she had a transplant before, na?
Yeah,
Yeah.
she was diagnosed as renal patient in 2013, started on dialysis in 2015, and within 9 months we went for transplant because she was not a good candidate for dialysis. Her veins and all get clot, and they find it very difficult to inject that syringes in needle points and
No,
also
that
she.
means renal replacement was done. Transplant is
Yeah.
the maximum you can do renal replacement. Beyond
Yes,
that, you cannot do. So, you had actually done everything. It's very unfortunate that her CKD was so advanced at such a young age, which means in almost mid 50s, she started having problems, or earlier
yes,
than that. So, her
no,
hypertension was uncontrolled.
yes,
Something
ma'am.
is not right, because it's so early to develop such severe CKD. Also, is some problem somewhere. So hypertension must have been aggressive, and
Mhm.
therefore she developed CKD, and already transplant was done. So a lot had been already done. After that, to develop and suffer so much is unfortunate. And I really feel you as family did all that you can, which is good. But I also feel it's important for the treating physicians to realize, because you have hope, right? Your mother, you want everything done, but
Yes,
somebody
ma'am.
has to sit you down and tell you this is not going to work, it's only going to end up in suffering. Yes, so 8com model is important also. Yeah, somebody has already done it. Excellent. So that's very good. So that is what I feel, that all doctors need to be trained in palliative care. It is not rocket science. You don't need some extra intelligence. It is just bringing back humanity into medicine, and which is what is lacking. That is why in India, the quality of death index is so bad. We rank amongst the 15 worst countries to die in. So it is really great that all you young people are into palliative care, because when I need it, there will be people who will give me palliative care. Like Arsha was asking, it is the right, if community people start asking for palliative care, corporate hospitals have to then budge. They will have to start having palliative care departments. And just like no hospital can be even thought of not having a casualty department, in the future we need all hospitals to have palliative care departments, because the amount of futility and medical unnecessary aggressive treatment we do in unindicated patients, especially in a country which is such less resources, also stretched by the pandemic, we should select patients correctly for aggressive treatment. And that selection can come only with planning, with talking to relatives, and by the fact that we have honest, compassionate doctors. We can't afford to have doctors who sit on their high horses and say, in my experience, this is what works. It might not work for everybody. It's not one size fits all. Sunil, or any other comment?
At any stage, at any stage of recovery, stage 5, did doctor have a meeting with you to discuss regarding this recovery stage, the defense stage, treatment stage, and what the dialysis is going to do with renal failure, etc.?
Uh,
Was that
see,
discussed?
our nephrologist, see, the one thing was what I feel bad about is our nephrologist CKD5, he said she can live on dialysis. That is what we see. As I said, in
Hmm.
2019 December, she was admitted with breathlessness. At that time, our nephrologist, he was just concerned with an organ called kidney, that he didn't
Hmm.
even look into the organ called heart. Like she was,
Yes.
most probably she was having a severe breathlessness because of her aortic stenosis.
Hmm.
So, and that must have, and we came to know about aortic stenosis very late. So it must have developed, it must have progressed in within 2 3 months, and that is the one thing I felt bad. So at that time also, he was only concerned about kidney, renal problem. It is post-transplant renal failure that he didn't even look into heart.
That is the sad part of our training. And secondly, but during the renal transplant, echo would have been done.
That, yeah, at that time it was fine. If we see the records of 2016 transplant, everything was done and everything was fine. In 2018, I don't know, all of a sudden we came to know that she has aortic stenosis of. So within from 2017 to 18, within this 2 years, something must have happened. So
Yeah.
that is when she started having breathlessness and all. So that is one thing. We were told about her this thing when we went for TAVR, like when we were planning to go, like what should we do with aortic stenosis? She's not able to do her basic functions like going to the washroom, and she was restless, as we know the symptoms of cardiac aortic stenosis and all. That time we were told that since she is a renal patient, it is going to worsen. So that was a choice which was given to us, whether to do the TAVR and worsen her renal condition, or not to do a TAVR and let her go like this. But as I said, we didn't have a palliative care access over here, and it was difficult for me to see her breathless throughout the day. Like she cannot stay, she doesn't want to stay in the hospital and all. So that was a call we made. Even if she lives for 6 months, let her live without breathlessness, because we know that when it becomes breathlessness, the patient become very anxious, the patient becomes very desperate somehow to pull the air out of everywhere. So seeing her in that state, we took that decision. I don't know whether the decision which we took was right or wrong.
So
But
there isn't anything
Uh,
right or wrong as far as you feel supported, and at least your issues and concerns were uh, uh, taken account of daily. See, the fact that she was already a poor candidate to start with, for sure. But what did she want? That is important, not your decision. See, autonomy. What did she want? You will feel less bad if that is what she wanted. We should do what the patients want. So, what did your mother want?
at that time, she definitely wanted to undergo TAVR because she find it
Did
very
she
difficult.
understand the consequences?
Yes, she
Did she
did.
understand? She did. She knew that it was a risky procedure.
She knew that it was a risk. What she said was, "I'll rather die rather than live in a state of breathlessness where I am gasping
So
for air."
there is where, Sunil, I feel that morphine would
yeah.
have changed her life. The
Yeah.
TAVR would not
Uh,
have been done if morphine was given. She was kept So her idea was to get comfortable, not cured. She knew she was incurable, Arsha.
Yeah, I believe she knew it because towards the last, when I signed for DNR and NET and all, she was not conscious. So I didn't ask her whether you want to. I was the one who made the decisions. We never had these discussions before. Before, like earlier on, she used to say, "I don't want to be a vegetable," and all she used to say. So I was not in Jaipur. Like when I came back to Jaipur, she was totally in a comatose stage. So then the decisions which were made not to put her on ventilator, not to do dialysis, or not to, or whatever is the maintenance treatment to be given, not to increase the NORAD, these all decisions were mine.
Yeah, but you never had a chance to speak to her,
Yeah, I never had a chance to speak to her.
despite the fact that she was CKD5 to begin with. That is the sad part, isn't it, Sunil? It's all CKD5 as
yeah,
such
yeah.
has poor prognosis, and nobody speaks. It's very, very difficult. But I have a question here to Mahesh Mohta. He has written interesting comment about ICU and palliative care, and I want him to clarify, if it's possible, about what he meant by nuisances after death. Mahesh, do you want to unmute yourself and clarify? Are they allowed? Are they able to unmute?
Yes, doctor, they are able to unmute.
Mahesh, would you like to clarify what you want? Because I want to uh, exactly understand what you meant by that comment. Are you there, Mahesh? It's okay. I'm not trying to, it's an open discussion. I'm not trying to point out anything. I just want to know what you make by that.
Okay. So here, I think your mother agreed for surgery because of unbearable breathlessness. So if she had an option of reducing breathlessness with some other intervention, I think she may not have undergone the surgery. But you need not feel regret about this because we are looking retrospectively, and
Yeah,
then
correct.
we are trying to analyze what happened and what not. So
Correct.
I think the problem here is there is no proper integration of palliative care with other specialties. So if this doctor had training in palliative care, I think he might have told you about what is going to happen and what are the options left behind, etc., etc., so that you would have been able to take an informed decision. Uh, so that's what here is lacking. Um, and it is possible to give palliative care at home by titrating morphine. And here, the renal failure, she has renal failure and creatinine is high, but still we will be able to titrate the dose of morphine. And if needed, methadone or even fentanyl patch or fentanyl injection can be given. But these are options even which can be provided at home. So she palliative care can be provided at home for her also.
There's a point, Sunil, by one Dr. Avnish Khare, which I would like to
Yes,
clarify if there is time,
yes,
about
yeah,
ICU patient selection. So,
mm,
Avnish, I appreciate that ICU is the biggest revenue generation for corporates, but we must remember that the revenue generated is in the first week of admission, because that's where maximum interventions, maximum investigations, and maximum imaging takes place. After that, if a patient is admitted, the expense kind of plateaus or falls off. Therefore, corporates also need to select those kind of patients where there is maximum turnover of beds and not one bed blocked by a chronic patient. So the simple algorithm of selection of patients comes from check out this gold standard framework. You 25% of patients in ICU shouldn't be in ICU in the first place. It's just simple common sense. We don't need any fancy tool. If you have simple criteria to decide that this patient does not have a good prognosis, should not be intubated, there's enough evidence in the literature to help us talk to the patients and family much in advance about the futility of ICU care. So it's very important for you to go through that gold standard framework. I've already sent you the link. And therefore, it is important to realize that you don't need, it's not a rocket science. You know, if the patient is elderly, multiple comorbidities, multiple admissions, you have patients of dementia on the ventilator. So that is completely ridiculous. You know, those patients are not going to make a difference. So very, very important. And yes, I'm glad that in critical care now, palliative care is included. And there is, therefore, we must realize that palliative care can be at home, in clinic, in emergency, in ward, in ICU. At every stage, you need to have a framework by which you have done something, you have to sit back, regroup, and think what can we do to in the best interest of the patient. What is it that we do to decrease the suffering? So that should be there. It's not that you put the patient on the ventilator and say, now we cannot remove it. Now let the patient die naturally. That is ridiculous. And even that is allowed by the Indian government to withdraw care. So it's very, very important that, yes, but it's sad. We need to do something. And I'm glad that all of you are a part of this process. And the young people, the younger the people joining and more converted to palliative care, there's a better future for this country. Thank you, everybody. No, palliative care reference, even families can ask. Families should, in fact, we need to educate doctors, we need to educate the community. It has to be demand and supply. People start asking, doctors have to give. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay, Sunil.
yeah, yes, yes.
Thank you, Raji.
So I think the palliative care should be available everywhere. Whenever somebody asks for palliative care, we should be able to provide palliative care. So this type of unhappiness and things like that will not happen. So hopefully, uh, maybe I don't know. After some time, we will have enough palliative care physicians and doctors integrating palliative care principles into that practice. Arsha, do you have any more questions?
So, no, sir.
So,
Arsha, do take
thank-
care and reach out if you need anything.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Take care. And my love and regards to all. Thank you. Bye.